Hi, this is Miss Parker, and in this video, we are going to go over the S.I.F.T.S poetry analysis strategy. First, let's make sure that we know what the verb sift means. One meaning is to separate what you want from something else. So in this image, we can see that the people are separating diamonds from muddy water using this screen. It can also mean to separate into small pieces. In this image, the workers are sifting dirt so that it doesn't have clumps, and they're doing this so that they can make bricks. When we're analyzing poetry, let's look at what the acronym or mnemonic device S.I.F.T.S stands for. First, it means to summarize. Then, look for imagery. Look for figurative language. Identify the tone or the author's attitude toward the subject of the poem. Look for a theme or a message about the poem. And then look for symbols that stand out to you in the poem as representing something else. When you're using the S.I.F.T.S strategy, it would make sense just to go down the list. However, it tends to work better if we use the strategy in this order. First, summarize the poem. Then, look for examples of imagery, figurative language, and symbols. And then finally, once you've found and identified those, come back and identify the tone or the author's attitude toward the subject of the poem, and then identify a theme or message that you notice in the poem. The reason for this is because imagery, figurative language, and symbols all lead to the tone of the poem, and the tone of the poem will often give you ideas about the theme. The first thing you're going to do is read through the poem to get a basic understanding of the poem. You're going to want to write a brief 1 or 2 sentence explanation about the contents of the poem. If the poem is longer or has multiple stanzas, then you probably want to write a summary of each stanza. These summaries should give the literal meaning of the poem or the stanza. You also want to include the topic of the poem. What is this poem about? In looking for imagery, you're going to find words that appeal to the 5 senses: touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell. When a poem shows you something instead of just telling you, that's imagery. So for example, if the author said, "The hot coals were red," that's just literal. But if the author writes, "The blistering coals glowed with crimson light," that gives us ideas of what the fire or the coals look like, and it also gives us an idea of the feeling of the heat coming off of them when the word blister is used. After you've gone through and found some examples of imagery, you'll also want to look for figurative language. Figurative language is when the author uses words in a way that they have meaning other than their literal meaning, and this is done for a specific effect. The next 2 slides have some common examples of figurative language on them. As you are identifying figurative language, it's a good idea to make notes of what that figurative language literally means. You can refer back to this slide and the next one for some examples of figurative language to look for in poetry. You're probably familiar with metaphors, similes. We've discussed irony in class, hyperbole, personification, and repetition is when we're looking at words being repeated for emphasis. Alliteration is a sound device in which we have several words that start with the same letter close to one another. Onomatopoeia, those are sound words. A euphemism is a word or a phrase that is used to make something that is often considered either rude, offensive, or unpleasant gentler. Look for rhyme as well, and look to see if you see any puns or plays on words. Remember that I suggested earlier that the two T's that you have in S.I.F.T.S should be the last thing that you do. But remember that tone is the author's attitude toward the topic of the poem. That's why it's so important to identify the topic as you are summarizing the poem. What's the attitude of the poem? What feelings does it have? How would you imagine the speaker or the author reading this poem? Imagine their voice, how it would sound, and the emotions that are brought up. I'll also come back and talk about theme as we do a model poem. The last S in S.I.F.T.S stands for symbolism. Symbolism is when we look for things in the poem that represent something more. A symbol is a concrete image that represents something abstract. So, for example, we often think of the American flag not just representing America, but also representing freedom or democracy, though for others that may have different symbolism. Now, I'm going to demonstrate using the S.I.F.T.S strategy using the poem Dreams by Langston Hughes. I have a feeling many of you will be familiar with this poem. Dreams by Langston Hughes. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. So the first thing I want to do after I've read through my poem is to identify the topic and summarize the poem. The topic of this poem is things you hope for. When we talk about dreams, we're not talking about the way your brain works as you sleep. We're talking about, in this poem, what you hope for. And a summary of this poem would be that life is worthless and boring if you don't have something to hope for. As I go through the next stages of S.I.F.T.S, I'm going to be looking for evidence that proves my summary that life is boring and dull if you don't have things to hope for. So the first thing we're looking for is images or sensory details. Now, I'm looking for words that help imagine sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. As I underline things, I have broken winged bird, which helps me imagine seeing that bird, probably with a bent broken wing that looks pretty pathetic. That barren field is quite empty. There's nothing there. It's frozen with snow. I'm imagining maybe it was once farmland, but now it's abandoned. We have the word frozen, which gives us a touch or a feeling. We can feel how cold it is. Okay, and now we're going to look for figurative language. What you'll notice is I've kept my underlines for my imagery, and a lot of my figurative language and my symbolism will overlap with my imagery. So, we're looking for and analyzing the use of non-standard language, such as those listed here. First, we have personification. Dreams die. Well, we know dreams can't actually die like human beings can, so that's personification. Life is a broken winged bird. That would be a metaphor comparing life directly to a bird with a broken wing. Life is a barren field is another metaphor. Now, we also have some diction. This is interesting because when the author says hold fast to dreams, it gives us two possible meanings. He could mean grab your dreams quickly, but also it could mean fast as in to fasten onto something. Hold it and not hold it tightly and not let it go. I think the author means both, but I think it's more important that we fasten onto our dreams rather than just grabbing them quickly. Next, we'll look at symbols. And as I said before, our symbols may overlap with our imagery and figurative language. So, I see the broken-winged bird as being a symbol for something that's helpless and pitiful. So the author is saying this life without dreams or hope is a helpless, pitiful life, something that we don't admire, we feel sorry for. The barren field shows something that is empty and lifeless. And then the snow, that would also symbolize winter, and winter often symbolizes an ending of things. Now, we're going to go back to the two T's, tone and theme. The reason we're coming back to them now, after we've identified our symbols, is because imagery, figurative language, and symbols help to figure out the tone, and tone often helps us figure out the theme. Now, the tone of our poem is the author's attitude toward the subject. Earlier we said that the subject of the poem was hopes or dreams. Now, the tone of the poem seems to be a bit haunting because we've got images of a broken-winged bird and an empty snow-covered field, and that makes life without dreams seem rather ominous or frightening. We may also say that there's a tone of warning because the author is warning us of what would happen if we don't hold on to our dreams. Finally, we'll look at the thematic idea of this poem. So we said that our topic or a thematic idea is hope. And in this poem, a thematic statement could be, in the poem Dreams, Langston Hughes presents the idea that giving up on one's hopes or dreams leads to an empty, unfulfilled life. Obviously, we can write more about that using the evidence that we found earlier to support and explain why this thematic statement is found in the poem. Why should we use the S.I.F.T.S strategy for analyzing poetry? First of all, when you read a poem, language is used creatively. Authors write to create images in the reader's mind and to raise emotion. Words are often used in unusual ways, and sometimes that can make poetry difficult to understand or grasp the full meaning of. So, we need to carefully analyze the words the author chooses so that we understand the author's intent and the creative and figurative meanings as well as the literal meanings of the poems. I hope this strategy helps you understand poems. It can be used quickly and easily to break down a poem and make sure that you're seeing the way that the author has used language to convey meaning.